welcome on Facebook, welcome on Zoom. If you're on Facebook, just know we have a discussion afterward on Zoom only. So if you're comfortable using Zoom, then, or if you'd like some help accessing that, we'd be glad to show that to you so you can join us for the discussion in the future weeks. So as we've heard, Ezekiel is quite the book for our times. This was a prophet that I considered when I was thinking in August, praying about our situation, even before these devastating fires. Ezekiel is a prophet for our times because he's prophesying to people who are in exile, who've been displaced. And, there's a lot of different ways to be in exile. I mean, it's not appropriate for us in Eugene, Oregon, or if you're watching from, somewhere else in our country, it's not appropriate for us to liken ourselves to political refugees who've been torn from their homes and who have not only had to leave their homes, but they know that their enemies are now living in their homes. This is not the same experience as we have. However, there's a lot of ways to be in exile. And so we can feel displaced between the country that we've known and the country that we see. We can feel displaced between the life we had compared to changes that have happened in our families, losses and griefs that we hold. As Bethesda, we are going through the transition of saying goodbye to Pastor Sarah, and as she embarks on her new call, that's an experience as well of being displaced from the pastors that we've known and loved and have served us. And so we are in that kind of a transition too. So things, being disoriented is nothing new. But in particular, this prophet Ezekiel, he's a really fine, it's a really fine prophet to study in our age, not only because of the comparisons I just made, but because he's so visual. For people who, we can watch a lot of TV, but it's a real struggle sometimes to read a book as long as we watch a TV show. Ezekiel is so visual. His imagery is so vivid that it really, I think, can grab us in a way that sometimes the teachings of Paul and some other things kind of leave us sort of flailing about for some vision that we can hold on to and understand it more clearly. The other thing that just jumps right off the page in chapter 1, if you haven't made it to Ezekiel chapter 1 yet, you can do so, is that it doesn't take but 4 verses to find fire. And so let me just, before I say some more introductory things about Ezekiel, let me read the first few verses of Ezekiel chapter 1. In the 30th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day of the month, I was among the exiles by the Kebar Canal. The heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th day of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim. The word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, in the land of the Chaldeans by the Kebar Canal. And the hand of the Lord was upon him there. As I looked, behold, a stormy wind came out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness around it, and fire flashing forth continually, and in the midst of the fire, as it were, gleaming metal. From the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures. So, I mean, what a stunning passage that we were planning to read today. As we've, of course, seen an ominous cloud blow in a couple of nights ago, and then have seen the devastation since. What we'll see in chapter 1 is Ezekiel, the priest, the son of a priest, and now commissioned to be a prophet. He receives this vision in chapter 1 that has basically 3 parts. He's going to see a vision of 4 living creatures. Then he's going to see a vision of wheels, even wheels inside of wheels. And then thirdly, he's going to see a vision of the temple or the throne of God, the dome above it all, and the glory of the Lord, or something like the glory of the Lord. And so this is Ezekiel's prophetic vision, which we can just look out our windows and imagine a fire orange sky, smoke billowing, and now being caught up into this prophetic vision as he is. One thing I find interesting about Ezekiel is he's a priest and a prophet. And sometimes Bible scholars try to divide these into clean categories. And so some might say that priests were ritualistic, and they had power and they had place, and they preserved the religious life of Israel, and so then they could become corrupt and more concerned with their power than with God's truth and worship. And then conversely, then the prophets become these radical figures in the scriptures that call the kings and the priests and the people of Israel back to true faithfulness to God and to remove idols from their midst. And so sometimes priests and prophets are kind of pitted against each other, or the establishment against the sort of radical individual that God calls to bring a word. But here Ezekiel is both. And this becomes really, I think, fitting for us as well, because we are connected, at least those of us at Bethesda, which is most of us watching today, we're connected to an institution, to a building, to a place that gathers us. Even though we've been displaced to the park and to the internet this year. And at the same time, we continually hear the word of the Lord that says, just because you have four walls and a roof, or because you have staff, or you have an institution, does not mean that you're faithful to God. It doesn't automatically go like this. And we need to continually hear the word of the Lord, his law, which confronts us, and his gospel, which comforts and frees us. And we hold these things together. And, there's plenty of people who will say, oh, the institutional church is such a mess. We're just going to have to follow Jesus on our own, or create little house church communities, and let's leave organized religion aside. Some go that route. Others go the other route and say it's all about the church. And then we get so suspicious of any upstart movement that doesn't have the church's blessing. But I hope, at Bethesda, at least, we can be centered on God's word in such a way that we try to organize our lives together as a congregation in a way that's faithful and also responsible and is flexible, but also doesn't just continually change with the times. These are difficult things, and Ezekiel is a good role model for us. Now, we know that the background is the time of the exile, but not all of us keep this history fresh in our minds. We're talking the 6th century BC. So a little more than 6 centuries before the coming of Jesus' incarnation. And so the briefest history lesson is that you have the kingdom of Israel, you have King Saul, then you have King David, then you have King Solomon, and then as Solomon's sons take the crown, the kingdom divides. This is about 1000 BC. And the kingdom divides north and south. Most of the tribes are in the northern kingdom of Israel, centered on Samaria. And then 2 tribes are in the south, centered on Jerusalem. And by 722, the Assyrian Empire has conquered the northern kingdom. It has removed the people of Israel and scattered them throughout their kingdom. Their method of conquer was to disperse pockets of people all across their empire, to basically assimilate them by dividing them up. So now 100 years after all of that, you begin to have the power of the Babylonian Empire, or the Neo-Babylonians, because they used to be powerful, now they're back. And so anytime in Ezekiel, we're going to see Chaldeans or Babylonians. There's a couple other terms for them. Basically, this would be King Nebuchadnezzar of Daniel fame, and some of his successors. The Babylonian Empire begins to threaten the southern kingdom, and in 593 BC, it actually can get dated to July 31st, but I don't have the details of how we get that specific. But in 593, Ezekiel receives this vision. And notice he's already in exile. So he's not in Jerusalem, he's in exile. And if you wanted to sometime, read the context of what happened just before this. 2 Kings 24. 2 Kings 24 and 25. The last 2 chapters of 2 Kings gives you the rundown of kind of what led from the king surrendering to Babylon, but getting to sort of remain in charge at Jerusalem and keep his kingdom, to then you get the sort of upper crust of Israel, the priests, the artists, the artisans, the builders, and so forth, basically the cream of the crop, they were exiled to Babylon. And Ezekiel himself was part of that initial wave of exiles. And I believe it was like 10,000 people or so. It gets numbered in groups at the end of 2 Kings. So Ezekiel was part of this sort of cream of the crop that Babylon moved to the center of their world, which would be modern day Iraq, but the city of Babylon. And then who remained on the land of Israel would be the poor, the people of the land, as sometimes they're called. And so this continues for a few years. And then in 589 on through to 587, you have Zedekiah, that's his new name, but he's a son of Jehoiakim. He tries to rebel again against Babylon, and now Jerusalem is crushed. The temple is destroyed. The walls of the city of Jerusalem are toppled. And from 587 forward, Israel is now, or Judah, the southern kingdom, is now fully defeated and in exile. And so it's not simply that Ezekiel and the refugees can picture their home far off, but they are going to receive word that it has in fact been destroyed once and for all. But we're not quite there yet. As Ezekiel starts his visions here in 593, we're still about 6 years out from the total destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. But the title I gave our study this fall is, Will the Glory of the Lord Return? Because that's first in this first chapter, we're going to see a vision of the glory of the Lord. But then also in a few chapters, we're going to see Ezekiel receiving a prophecy. He's going to tell the exiles, by the way, the Lord's glory is going to depart the temple in Jerusalem. Lo and behold, that does come to be by 587. And then much of the book of Ezekiel, once it moves past the judgments and the confrontation, the second half of Ezekiel, especially the last 8 chapters, gives a very hopeful vision about the restoration of Jerusalem and the temple. So you could basically divide this book into 2 sections. It's 48 chapters, and if you know my previous classes, we're actually not this time going to read verse by verse for 48 chapters. Even though we might be able to squeeze it in this fall, I don't want to do that to any of us. So what I'll do is I'll summarize, and then I'll read the key parts, and then I'll give you like assigned reading for the week ahead. So if I don't say it later, read chapters 4 through 7 for next week. 4 through 7. Next week, we'll give you some of Ezekiel's initial visual demonstrations of his prophetic message. He not only says things for the Lord, he does things that illustrate God's word. So 4 through 7 is for next Thursday if you want to read the entirety of it. But for today, 1 through 3, the first 3 chapters, we're going to see the commissioning of Ezekiel. We're going to see this in 5 kind of waves. He gets commissioned several times. But before we get to his commissioning in chapter 2 and 3, let's take a look at this initial vision, this vision that comes out of the fire and the cloud as the northern wind blows it toward him. As I looked, verse 4, a stormy wind came out of the north, a great cloud with brightness around it and fire flashing forth continually, and in the middle of the fire something like gleaming amber. And in the middle of it was something like 4 living creatures. This was their appearance. They were of human form. Each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the sole of a calf's foot, and they sparkled like burnished bronze. If you're trying to visualize this or scribble a picture, you don't have to. You'll be confused by the end. You can just Google an image of it. Under their wings, on their 4 sides, they had human hands, and the 4 had their faces and their wings like this. Their wings touched each other. Each of them moved straight ahead without turning as they moved. As for their appearance of their faces, the 4 had the face of a human being, the face of a lion on the right side, the face of an ox on the left side, and the face of an eagle. Such were their faces. Their wings were spread out above. Each creature had 2 wings, each of which touched the wing of another, while 2 covered their bodies. Each moved straight ahead. Wherever the Spirit would go, they went, without turning as they went. In the middle of the living creatures, there was something that looked like burning coals of fire, like torches moving to and fro among the living creatures. The fire was bright, and lightning issued from the fire. The living creatures darted to and fro like a flash of lightning. This is the first part of the vision. If you've studied Revelation with us or on your own, you might recognize the throne room scene in Revelation 4. In that vision, John sees 4 living creatures, but each creature is its own animal. So you have 1 ox and 1 lion and 1 man and 1 eagle. But he's drawing on the imagery here in Ezekiel. And in this image in Ezekiel, each creature has each of these 4 faces. And we're about to see that they're on top of a chariot. They're on top of wheels. So verse 15, as I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creatures, one for each of the 4 of them. As for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like the gleaming of beryl, and the 4 had the same form, their construction being something like a wheel within a wheel. When they moved in any of the 4 directions without veering as they moved. Their rims were tall and awesome, for the rims of all 4 were full of eyes all around. When the living creatures moved, the wheels moved beside them, and when the living creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose. And this is key. Wherever the Spirit would go, they went, and the wheels rose along with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When they moved, the others moved. When they stopped, the others stopped. And when they rose from the earth, the wheels rose along with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. Okay, that's the second piece of this vision, second of 3 pieces. So you have the 4 living creatures, then you have the wheels. So you begin to put these things together and say, what in the world are we looking at? There is a story that comes from Jerome, who was an early Catholic church father, and he picked it up, a rabbinic tradition, that in the Jewish tradition, nobody would be allowed to read or hear the words of Ezekiel chapter 1 until they were 30 years old. And there's kind of different reasons for that, but the primary one is when you're young and audacious, you hear a vision like this and you run wild with it, and you either make too many associations and say, okay, this is exactly what it means, or it overwhelms you and you don't understand the message it's actually trying to convey. One of the things that's going on here with these 4 living creatures on their wheeled chariot that can go in any direction without veering or turning. You can almost picture a wheel going this way and then another wheel at a right angle inside of that wheel. Or you might just picture like a sphere. And so these 4 creatures can just go anywhere the Spirit leads, up, down, and in any direction. And these images of lions, eagles, an ox, and a human, this kind of imagery would be all over Babylon. As the exiles are living in Babylon, they would see all kinds of statues and iconography that paints a picture of the deities or the gods of Babylon. And here in this vision now, all of these images get put together and then animated by the Spirit. And then the third piece of the vision, which we're about to hear, is now the dome that covers them and the glory of the Lord and the throne of the Lord that is over them. And so Ezekiel's beginning by using visual pictures that the Babylonians would recognize and that his own fellow Israelite exiles would recognize. And he's going to now say, there is no unseen power or divine power that is apart from the sovereignty of God. So with a lion, you can imagine the ferocity and strength of God. With an eagle, you can imagine the freedom and the swiftness, the presence of God. With an ox, you can imagine not only that God is valuable to the domestic home, but that God is also a symbol of fertility or productivity or fruitfulness. And then, of course, the human, made in the image of God, invested with divine majesty, it reflects the intelligence of God, the rational ability of God. And so as all these creatures kind of come together, they put together a real picture of the divine. Now, later on in Ezekiel chapter 10, he will point out that these creatures were cherubim, like one form of angels. If you have a painting of cherubim, it probably has like a fat baby, and it's very cute. But this would be a great example of cherubim not being so cute, but being quite majestic and overwhelming. And so, in a lot of the visions of Ezekiel, there's something like this or something like that, and there's sort of these messengers of God, the cherubim, or the image that carries God. But then it is also this sense that God himself is actually present and is actually speaking. And now we get to the final part of this vision, the throne. So from chapter 20, from verse 22. Over the heads of the living creatures, there was something like a dome, shining like crystal, spread out above their heads. Under the dome, their wings were stretched out straight, one toward another, and each of the creatures had 2 wings covering its body. When they moved, I heard the sound of their wings like the sound of mighty waters, like the thunder of the Almighty. A sound of tumult like the sound of an army. When they stopped, they let down their wings, and there came a voice from above the dome over their heads. When they stopped, they let down their wings. And above the dome over their heads, there was something like a throne, in appearance like sapphire. And seated above the likeness of a throne was something that seemed like a human form. Upward from what appeared like the loins, I saw something like gleaming amber, something that looked like fire enclosed all around. Downward from what looked like loins, I saw something that looked like fire, and there was a splendor all around. Like the bow in a cloud on a rainy day, such was the appearance of the splendor all around. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. When I saw it, I fell on my face, and I heard the voice of someone speaking. So now by the end of chapter 1, Ezekiel is floored. He has seen these living creatures that draw together all of the religious imagery of his context. He sees that they move swiftly in any and every direction without ever losing sight of what is happening. There's eyes all over the wheels, and there's faces pointing in every direction. And all of this is animated by the Spirit, which the Spirit will be prominent throughout this book, all animated by the same divine power. And now as he sees this dome over the head and the likeness of a throne and something like a human form on the throne, now this vision is completed with the picture of God himself, sovereign over all of this, glorious and majestic, but unable to be captured in words. The most we get is something like this and something like that, finally saying, the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And so you get this anthropomorphic or like human form vision of God, which anticipates, of course, for Christians, this anticipates the incarnation of Jesus, the Son of God, and not only gives us the imagery for John's throne room vision in Revelation chapter 4, but also connects to John chapter 1 in the beginning of the Gospel of John, when we talk about the Word becoming flesh and living among us, and going on to say that we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. And so here in Ezekiel, we have a human form on the throne. We have the glory of the Lord, but whereas we cannot take it in with our eyes, here Ezekiel falls on his face, and now he has to have an ear to hear the word of the Lord. One really crucial thing I want to say about this entire first chapter and this vision he receives is that he is receiving this vision in exile. This is not God calling to him from Jerusalem, or this is not him remembering when he was in the temple and saw a vision of God like Isaiah the prophet did. This is God present in Babylon. This is God in the midst of the cloud and the fire. This is God in the midst of the 4 living creatures that resemble all the deities and all the various images in Babylon. And God is in the midst of exile. God is with his people. This is not a tribal deity that gets connected to a particular mountain or valley or river or temple, but this is the God of all creation who can travel in any direction, whose word can go forth on this chariot of living creatures in any direction without losing sight of anything. And this God now is with his people. Some 5 years into the exile, God is with his people, and we're going to see in the next couple of chapters, which I'm going to stop us here for this week. But what we will see in the commissioning of Ezekiel is that not only is God with him in exile, but what God has for Ezekiel to demonstrate and to say is first a hard word. It's first a word that's actually going to first prophesy against Jerusalem and the temple and the people of Israel back home, before it can then break into words of comfort for those who are in exile. It's going to take us a few chapters, well, more than a few chapters, and a few weeks to get to most of the hopeful images in this book. We will see a glimpse or two along the way. But at first, the most hopeful thing is God is with us in the midst of the dislocation. God has not been overcome. God has not been put far off, or we have not been removed from God's presence, but that God is in all places and is speaking to us. So I'm going to wait for next week to talk about Ezekiel's commissioning. This happens in chapters 2 and 3, so you can read 2 and 3 and then 4 through 7. But basically, we're going to see that Ezekiel is promised from God to give a word that people will not listen to, but not to take it personally because they don't listen to God either. But that nevertheless, Ezekiel must give this warning to Israel. If he does not, then he's responsible for Israel's sins. And so he's given this very difficult word, and the first image we'll see is that the word of the Lord tastes sweet as honey, but it is a bitter word as it goes down. But I just want to leave it with that. This is where we're going now. Let me give you a couple of previews of the weeks ahead, just in case you don't want the next few weeks of unrelenting warning and prophetic judgment. We're going to see a few things that I don't want you to miss. For example, we are going to see God's promise to give Israel a new heart, to not simply give Israel a new law or return them to the law, but to actually give Israel a new capacity to live as God's people. So there's a death and death and resurrection activity going on. We're going to see that God keeps his covenant, that even if Israel has thrown themselves into exile one way or another, that God is faithful to his promise. And he will promise to Ezekiel that a remnant shall return to the land, to restore the temple and the city. We're going to see images of God as a shepherd. We're going to see God's glory returning and see a new temple. And we're going to see images going all the way back to the Garden of Eden as this sort of new Eden is restored with the temple. All of these, we're going to see promises of the gift of the Spirit. We're going to see the valley of dry bones, them dry bones. Although that's 37 chapters away. We're going to see God cleansing his people of their sins, restoring their fortunes. We're going to see a picture or a preview of baptism, of God's means of using water to convey his promises and his presence. So all these gospel themes are coming up for us. But in the meantime, most of the early part of Ezekiel is going to be demonstrations and declarations of the coming judgment, a judgment that Israel has brought on themselves, and that even so could be turned aside were people to heed God's word. So we have some challenges in store, but again, we're gonna find over these next coming weeks that no matter how dislocated we get here, and now in Oregon we've got one more fiery layer on top of everything else that we've faced in 2020. But God is with us in the storm and the fire, and God's word will go out. There's no direction that God cannot see, nor that his word cannot reach. And it's going to be up to you and me as the people of God in Christ to convey that word and to convey that hope. To, as Judy pointed out in the reading from Eugene Peterson at the beginning of the hour, to be people not of despair, but people of hope. And to not be people of denial, but to be people who see what's really going on and try to do something about that. So, for next week, read 2 and 3 for his commissioning, and then read 4 through 7 for some of his initial demonstrations, including how to barbecue with manure. Actually, not even manure, how to barbecue with poop. That's going to be one of his first demonstrations. So much to come in the way of vivid prophetic imagery. Let me see if I can sign off on Facebook without too much trouble, and then we'll open up the Zoom discussion. Thank you. Several people have come and gone on Facebook, and so I welcome you, Larry and Barbara and Leanne and Hannah and Marilyn, Mom, Carol, and any others who've come and gone. Really appreciate you checking it out. And we'll pick it up next week in chapter 2 and all that. Also, just stay tuned. We'll put out word as far as whether we'll worship in the park this Sunday or whether we will move indoors or whether we'll simply go online only for this week. So just keep an eye on your email or Facebook as we determine when we'll even know if it'll be possible to be outside this weekend. So God bless you and keep you. Facebookers, Zoom crew, stick around and we'll chat. I'll take a drink so I can talk. I don't know if you've noticed, like, I think it's the air quality in here. Like when I'm talking, all of a sudden I can't speak. And I don't know about you. When I took a shower last night, my throat hurt. So I don't know what's going on in the water, but man, by the end of the shower, I was almost wanting to cough. Okay, so let's see. Facebook Live, stop. Okay, bye Facebook. And in just a moment,